Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Professor Wagaman. You know, you made a big mistake, however, and that is you didn't give me a time limit. You know, once I start talking about Lafayette, sometimes it's tough to get me to stop. Early in my speaking career, I was invited, before they gave me time limits, I was invited to be the third speaker at a convention of the American Canadian Genealogical Society in Manchester, New Hampshire. And after my talk, it was like a free period for 2 hours for lunch. So I figured I had plenty of time on my hands. So I'm going on and on and on. And the director, I see her in the back of this big room. I see her go out the back door, walk down the hall. I could hear her heels clicking, come in alongside me right over there. And I tried to ignore her as I was just getting going. And finally, she became a distraction. So I said to her, "Pauline, how many minutes do I have left?" And she said, "-10." So, but the one thing you've got going for you is I have a plane to catch this evening. It's a pleasure to be here and to try to help you through these difficult times after the NCAA verdict of last weekend. I was actually, after you beat Lafayette so badly, I was actually rooting for you to go all the way. But in any event, I'm here to talk to you about Lafayette in America. In 1846, Ensigns and Thayer of New York published a colored broadside entitled Pictorial History of the United States. First slide, please. In this broadside, there's a lot of printed information, including the census from 1790 and 1840, events of the Revolution and the War of 1812, a list of eminent men, and there are the seals of all the states and the territories around the perimeter. And there are three figures in the middle under the title Pictorial History of the United States: Washington, to his left, Franklin, and on his good right hand, Lafayette, under the title Pictorial History of the United States. Not Jefferson or Madison or Adams or Hamilton or even Jackson, but a Frenchman, Lafayette. Curious, isn't it? But I'm here to tell you not so much. The next slide is a close-up of the three major figures. It was June 17th, 1825, the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. On that day, the American people gathered in Charlestown, Massachusetts, to attend the laying of the cornerstone of the monument and to hear the address by Daniel Webster. The guest of honor on that occasion was General Lafayette. It was the 10th month of his 13-month tour of America, called the Farewell Tour. On that day, Lafayette, a Freemason since 1776, helped lay the cornerstone with Daniel Webster and the chief architect. The next slide is a print from 1900 of Lafayette. It looks like he is supervising the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. Then there was a procession to a spot on the side of the hill where a vast amphitheater had been constructed. According to Auguste Levasseur, the author of Lafayette in America, in 1824 and 1825, there were 45,000 people present. The 15,000 in the amphitheater were arranged as follows. Lafayette was sitting in the front in an armchair as the guest of honor. Behind him, immediately behind him, were the remnants of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Then other Revolutionary veterans. Then 2,000 ladies, brilliantly dressed, who, quote, seemed to form a guard of honor to these venerable graybeards. More than 10,000 others were seated behind the ladies on the numerous benches, placed in a semicircle at the side of the hill. Another 30,000 were at the summit, perhaps out of earshot of the speaker. After the prayer by Dr. Thaxter, himself a veteran of Bunker Hill, Webster began his speech. In the middle of his panoramic review of American history, with special emphasis, of course, on the Battle of Bunker Hill and the American Revolution, he turned to Lafayette and addressed him directly. And he said in part, "Fortunate, fortunate man, what measures of devotion do you owe to Providence, which has plotted out the circle of your extraordinary life? You belong to both hemispheres, to two generations. Heaven saw fit that the electric spark of liberty should be conducted by you from the new world to the old, and we, whom duty and patriotism have called here, long ago learned from our fathers to cherish your name and your virtues. The next slide is a portrait of Lafayette. It's apocryphal because, of course, the monument wasn't constructed when he was there, and it has the names of a lot of revolutionary heroes on the monument, which is also apocryphal because there are no names on the Bunker Hill Monument. In the 19th century and up to the 1930s, Lafayette's reputation in America was extraordinary. He was already popular before his arrival in 1824 when he came as the last surviving Major General of the Continental Army. He was popular by virtue of his important role in the Revolution, his subsequent activities on behalf of his adoptive land, America, his close friendship with George Washington, and his storybook life. However, this trip, during which he toured the country and each of its 24 states and was treated as a conquering hero, reaffirmed his reputation and elevated him into iconic status. The only analogies that I could think of to the ecstasy, really, that with which he was received is, for example, the Beatles tour in the 1960s and how teenagers responded to the Beatles, and also the visit of John Paul II in 1979. In the 19th century, when state banks printed legal tender, Lafayette's face appeared on bills in more states than any other person but George Washington. The next slide is a couple of examples. The one on the bottom has Washington and Lafayette, and the one on the top has Lafayette, and I think Washington's also, although that might be Jefferson over there. Scores of cities, towns, and counties and townships were named either Lafayette, Fayette, Fayetteville, Lafayetteville, or LaGrange, the name of the chateau that he lived in from 1800 to 1834. The next slide is Chateau LaGrange. That's from the front. And the following slide is another view of the Chateau LaGrange. There are even one or two LaGrangevilles. In Pennsylvania, we have Fayette County. The county seat is Uniontown. We have a Fayette City, a Fayetteville, a Lafayette, and a LaGrange. There are countless streets, squares, and parks. In Philadelphia alone, you can find a Lafayette Street and a Fayette Street. Numerous statues and monuments were built to honor Lafayette. One of my favorites is the next slide by Daniel Chester French, who later did the Lincoln Memorial. It's in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. It's a bas-relief, although the Lafayette figure is full body. Mount Lafayette was named for General Lafayette in 1824 by the good people of Franconia, New Hampshire. Lafayette College in eastern Pennsylvania was named in 1826 as a result of the farewell tour. There is even, I found this out when I was working on this talk, there is even a Penn State Fayette in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, part of the university system. There is a Lake Lafayette in northern Florida and a Lafayette River in southern Virginia. After France gave America the Statue of Liberty, America reciprocated. An equestrian statue of Lafayette by Paul Wayland Bartlett was given to France in 1908. It was called the Children's Statue because it was paid for by coins collected by millions of American school children. It stood outside the Louvre until a pyramid was constructed, some say as a future set for the movie The Da Vinci Code, which event caused its removal to a different location in Paris on the right bank of the Seine. It's near the Statue of, well, not too near the Statue of Liberty, but not too far. The next slide is the Children's Statue at its new location. The next slide is another statue. This one is on Lafayette Square, New York City, on the southeastern tip of Morningside Park in Manhattan. It's Lafayette and Washington, and there are two flags. Prior to America's entry in the Great War on the side of the Allies in 1917, volunteer American flyers joined a French squadron under a French commander, which became known as the Lafayette Escadrille. Others, members of the Lafayette Flying Corps, were dispersed into the French armed forces, or their air forces. President Wilson used Lafayette as a symbol of French aid to America in our revolution to drum up support for our entry into the Great War on the side of the Allies. A poem called The Sword of Lafayette appeared. This poem begins with some slight exaggeration as follows. It was the time of our despair when lion-hearted Washington, that man of patience and of prayer, looked sadly at each rising sun. In all the freedom-breeding air of hope and rescue there was none, when lo, as down from heaven let, there came the sword of Lafayette. After the arrival of the American Expeditionary Force in Paris in 1917, General Pershing visited Lafayette's tomb, where his aide, Colonel Stanton, said famously, "Lafayette, we are here." The next slide is General Pershing at Lafayette's tomb in Paris. A song, "Lafayette, We Hear You Calling," was published in 1918. The next slide is the sheet music from Lafayette, We Hear You Calling. The day after his arrival in France in December of 1918 for the treaty negotiations, President Wilson visited Pequot Cemetery and had a wreath laid at Lafayette's tomb with a card that said, "In memory of the great Lafayette, from a fellow servant of liberty." In 1919, Wilson named a national park in Maine, the first national park east of the Mississippi, the Lafayette National Park. Next slide, please. That's a brochure, 1923, from the Lafayette National Park. Unfortunately, we lost that one in 1929 when donors, a husband and wife, offered to double the land of what is now known as Acadia National Park if the name were changed. The donors actually were British citizens, with a long memory, perhaps. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed the joint session of Congress on May 20th, 1934, the 100th anniversary of Lafayette's death. And the next slide is President Roosevelt addressing the joint session of Congress. And there were commemorative events throughout the country. There were 3 commemorative stamps honoring Lafayette between the 1950s and the 1970s. The next slide is one from 1957, the 200th anniversary of his birth. In this century, the Senate made Lafayette an honorary citizen in 2002, and the House passed a resolution honoring him on his 250th birthday in 2007. However, it's not quite the same today as it was in the 19th century or even the early part of the 20th century. America, alas, seems to have forgotten Lafayette. As proof of this, I will cite to you an article that appeared in the newspaper of record, the New York Times, on August 31st, 2007, about the then impending exhibition at the New York Historical Society about Lafayette and his on the occasion of his 250th birthday. Well, in this article, the author writes, the society dispatched summer interns to different neighborhoods, including 2 of the streets in the city. There are actually 10, named for Lafayette, one in Manhattan and one in Brooklyn. The interns, history students at UCLA, asked dozens of people what they knew about the old boy. The responses boiled down to, "Lafayette, we are clueless." Definitely among the younger generation, not a soul knew who Lafayette was, said Louise Muir, the Historical Society's president. Even older New Yorkers offered responses like, "Never heard of him," or, at best, if they were really on the ball, "Sounds French." But one fireman knew quite a lot, Dr. Mira said. That was reassuring. Well, if you think about it, it's appropriate that a first responder should be the one to know something about Lafayette, for that's what he was, a first responder to our cause. So why was Lafayette America's idol in the 19th century and even the first half of the 20th century? The answer is he played a critical role in our revolution and continued to support American interests throughout his life. He was simply the best friend this country ever had. He also strived to spread the ideas and the ideals of the American Revolution to Europe, and he reaffirmed his close connection to this country during the farewell tour in 1824 and 1825. He was born in Auvergne, France in 1757 at the next slide, the Chateau Chavignac. and he inherited a prestigious title and great wealth upon the early death of his father in the 7 Years' War, and later his mother and maternal grandfather. Lafayette traveled to America in April of 1777 to join our revolution on a ship purchased and provisioned with his own funds, carrying with him a commission in the Continental Army, making him a major general, a commission having been handed to him by our representative Silas Deane. At that time, he was only 19 years old and a mere captain in the French Army on furlough. You can ask, I'll feed you a question to ask me later. Ask me how that happened. He was introduced to Washington at a tavern in Philadelphia on July 31st, 1777, and invited to join his staff and serve initially as a volunteer without a command. On September 11, 1777, 5 days after his 20th birthday, in the Battle of the Brandywine, part of the British Army's successful campaign to take Philadelphia, he dismounted from his horse and drew his sword to turn the retreating American soldiers around to face the British, and was wounded in the leg. By November of 1777, Washington was so impressed with the young man's courage, prudence in war councils, and character that he petitioned the Continental Congress to give him a field command. By December, when the Army entered its winter quarters at Valley Forge, Congress had approved, and Washington put Lafayette in charge of a division of 3,000 Continentals, not an inconsiderable part of the Continental Army. The next slide is a 19th century print of Lafayette and Washington at Valley Forge. In 1778, he fought in an abortive campaign to invade Canada, in the Battle of Barren Hill, Pennsylvania, in the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey, and in August in the Battle of Rhode Island, during which Lafayette and the troops that he had brought from the American encampments in White Plains to support the invasion of Aquidneck Island reached the ramparts of Newport, which was under British occupation. After the French fleet, having been battered by a storm during a naval engagement with a British squadron up from New York, returned to Boston for repairs, Lafayette left the island and rode to Boston to try to persuade the Count d'Estaing to return at least part of the fleet to Newport to support the invasion. Although he did not succeed in this endeavor, he played an important role in preserving the French alliance, which had recently been formalized in the Treaty of Friendship in 1778. After New Hampshire General John Sullivan, the campaign's commander-in-chief, publicly blasted the Count d'Estaing for leaving the scene of an invasion. Lafayette returned to Rhode Island in time to assist in the evacuation of the rear guard of American forces to the mainland. For his service in this campaign, he was awarded a congressional commendation. The next slide is a painting from life, Charles Wilson Peale, of Lafayette in 1778. Lafayette returned to France in 1779 and lobbied for more money and material, the return of the French fleet, and French land troops. It is fair to say that he and Ben Franklin were most responsible for the decision made by the French court to provide this aid in 1780. In March, Lafayette sailed back to America on the frigate Hermione to tell his paternal friend Washington that help was on the way. Help arrived in July of 1780 when General Rochambeau and 5,000 troops and a small French squadron arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, which the British had evacuated by that time. Lafayette's major military contribution to the American cause ensued in 1781 when he was sent to Virginia with 1,000 Continentals. In a campaign of skirmishes and smoke and mirrors, he and his undermanned army managed to entrap Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, where Cornwallis and his 7,000 regulars were defeated after the French West Indian fleet arrived under the Count de Grasse, and Washington's and Rochambeau's armies joined Lafayette's troops for the siege of Yorktown. Next slide is a 1791 engraving, French, of Lafayette at Yorktown, and he's pointing to the French fleet in the York River. Lafayette returned to France a hero at age 24 and was made a Maréchal de Camp in the French army, which is the equivalent of a major general. During the 1780s in France, Lafayette played an important role in supporting American diplomacy and interest, first with Franklin and later with Jefferson from 1785 to 1789, when Jefferson was our minister to Paris. When Lafayette visited Monticello in November of 1824, Jefferson took him to the University of Virginia to show him the new university. At an event in Lafayette's honor held in the Rotunda, Jefferson had a speech read for him that described Lafayette's role on behalf of America when Jefferson was our minister to Paris. With regard to the accomplishments of American diplomacy, one at that time, which included opening up numerous French ports to American goods on favorable terms and saving the whaling industry, particularly the whaling industry in Nantucket, Massachusetts, by arranging a contract to supply all the street lamps of Paris with Nantucket whale oil, Jefferson said of Lafayette, as only Jefferson could, "I only held the nail, he drove it." In 1786, the good people of Nantucket at town meeting decided to express their gratitude by dedicating one day's milk from every cow on the island to produce a 500-pound cheese, which they sent to Lafayette in France. The next slide is a children's book that appeared in 1950, A Cheese for Lafayette. On the reverse jacket, it has a newspaper account of the town meeting. One of my audience suggested to me about this little story or incident that it's like sending coals to Newcastle to send cheese to the French. Later, Lafayette played an important role in the French Revolution. He's the only person who played a major role in both revolutions. He called for the summoning of a National Assembly in the 1787 Assembly of Notables and was a major player from 1789 to 1791, principally in his role as Commandant General of the National Guard of Paris, a citizens' militia created shortly after the storming of the Bastille. He was also the principal author of the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which became the preamble to the Constitution of 1791. His efforts to preserve order and mediate between the king and the people ultimately failed, and when the Jacobins' influence grew, he went over the northern border. Imprisonment in German and Austrian dungeons and exile in Danish Holstein and Holland followed, and then upon his return to France in late 1799, retirement of a gentleman farmer until 1815 during the 100 days of Napoleon's return, when Lafayette served briefly in the Chamber of Deputies, and later from 1818 to 1823 during the Bourbon Restoration, when he served as one of the liberal bloc in the Chamber. He was defeated in the election of February 1824. Propitiously, in March 1824, President Monroe's invitation to visit America arrived, and Lafayette decided to accept it. In July, he departed for America with his son, George Washington Lafayette, with Monsieur Levasseur, Auguste Levasseur, his private secretary, and a valet. This trip, a farewell tour, was a unique event in our history. Here is this 67-year-old man, tall but somewhat portly, who walks with a limp and with a cane and wears a hairpiece, who has wielded no military power or political authority since 1792, who then held no public position either in his native land or in his adopted land, America, and he is treated like a conquering hero, like a Caesar or an Alexander, for 13 months in every corner of a vast country. There are parades, militia reviews, dinners, banquets, balls, meet and greets with school children and members of diverse private societies. There are dedications of public buildings, a plethora of speeches, and customary and voluntary toasts. Triumphal arches are constructed out of wood welcoming Lafayette in many cities. Americans of all races, each gender, and of every age wanted to touch this man who had done so much for their country. A whole cottage industry of consumer goods was created. There were Lafayette prints, fans, buttons, bandanas, medallions, sheet music, bottles, brushes, baby shoes, hats, ribbons. This is an example. The next slide is an example of a Lafayette ribbon. This one was worn by the school children of Boston when he arrived in Boston. There are Lafayette scarves. The next slide is a Lafayette scarf from 1824 in Philadelphia, a welcome Lafayette scarf. There is a welcome Lafayette drums, Staffordshire and other ceramic coffee pots, plates, platters, bowls, and jugs, including a set of dishes depicting Lafayette's arrival in New York City, and ladies' kid gloves with his face imprinted on it. The next slide are two examples of Lafayette gloves. The second one has Washington and Lafayette. Every American painter wanted to, and many did, paint him from life. For example, Samuel Morse won the competition of the city of New York. The next slide is Morse's Lafayette. He's contemplating the busts of Washington and Franklin with an empty pedestal waiting for his bust. That slide is at New York City Hall today. And the next slide is Philadelphia's competition to that by Thomas Sully, and it's Lafayette outside of Independence Hall. I like that one best. It's on the jacket of my book. But if you want it to be preserved in the most pleasing manner for posterity, with all the wrinkles out, you would hire Thomas Sully to paint your portrait. On August 15th, 1824, the Cadmus arrived in New York Bay. The next slide is the only known painting of the Cadmus. It was painted in 1822 before it became famous as the ship that brought Lafayette to America. As Levasseur contemplated Staten Island to his left, the noise of a cannon caught my attention from another side. It was the artillery of Fort Lafayette, which was announcing the arrival of the Cadmus to the city of New York. The next slide is a painting, 19th century painting. That's Fort Lafayette, that structure. It was unfortunately blown up to make way for the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in 1960. I grew up about 12 blocks from that spot. And of course, I wasn't a Lafayetteophile at the time, or I would have been outraged. Because it was a Sunday, Lafayette disembarked in Staten Island and stayed at the home of then Vice President Tompkins, Daniel Tompkins. On the following day, he arrived at Castle Garden at the southern tip of Manhattan on the Chancellor Livingston, accompanied by a small flotilla of boats, and was welcomed by all the military and civilian dignitaries of the city and a crowd of 200,000. The next slide is one of those ceramic plates that I mentioned to you before. It's the landing of Lafayette at Castle Island. That structure, Castle Island, which was originally an 1812 fort called Castle Clinton or Fort Clinton, still exists. It has had an interesting career. It was an amusement arena when Lafayette arrived in 1824 and 1825. Towards the end of the 19th century, it became the precursor of Ellis Island. Immigrants would have to go to that structure before they were admitted. It then became the New York City Aquarium, and I remember seeing it when I was a teenager, going to the New York City Aquarium. Today it's a ticket office for the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. There is a plaque outside, or a marker outside, about Lafayette's having been there. Having been feted in New York City, Lafayette headed for Boston on August 20th, 1824 on the Old Post Road. He arrived on the 24th, having stopped in many cities and towns in Connecticut, including New Haven, where he stopped at Yale, New London, and in Providence, Rhode Island. On the morning of the 24th, he was joined by a procession of 70,000 people as he headed to Boston from the Shirley Eustace House, which still stands in Roxbury, where he had spent the night. At the State House, he was addressed by the governor and replied. In the afternoon, there was a dinner at the Exchange Tavern. In the evening, he visited John Hancock's widow at her home. Now, he had known the Hancocks from the Revolutionary times. This visit is memorialized in Louisa Day Alcott's An Old-Fashioned Girl, which was published in 1869, about a year before Little Women. While it is a work of fiction, the story has the ring of truth to it, and its veracity is supported by the familial relationship between Louisa May Alcott's mother and Dorothy Quincy Hancock. They were all related to the Quincy family. Mayor Quincy was the mayor of Boston at the time. So in this book, the grandmother is telling her grandchildren and a family friend about Lafayette's visit. Well, by and by, the general, escorted by the mayor, drove up. Dear me, I see him now, a little old man in nankeen trousers and vest, a long blue coat and rustled shirt, leaning on his cane, for he was lame, and smiling and bowing like a true Frenchman. As he approached, the three old ladies rose and curtsied with the utmost dignity. Lafayette bowed first to the governor's picture, that's Hancock's picture, then to the governor's widow, and kissed her hand. That was droll, for on the back of her glove was stamped Lafayette's likeness, and the gallant old gentleman kissed his own face. Then some of the young ladies were presented, and as if to escape any further self-salutations, the Marquis kissed the pretty girls on the cheek. Yes, my dears, here is just the spot where the dear old man saluted me. I'm quite as proud of it now as I was then, for he was a brave, good man and helped us in our trouble. Now the next slide is another Lafayette glove. This one came down in the family of Mayor Quincy, one of his daughters, Eliza Quincy. So it's likely the type of glove that Madam Hancock was wearing on that occasion. While in Boston, Lafayette visited Harvard College, where Edward Everett addressed him, and went to Charlestown, where he was invited to return for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill to help lay the cornerstone the following June. He told them that if he was still in the country, he would come, but he wasn't certain at that time how long he would be staying. He also visited John Adams in Quincy, and on August 31st, he headed north, stopping on a rainy day for events in Lynn, Marblehead, Salem, Beverly, Ipswich, and Newburyport, a typical day on the farewell tour. Citizens of New Hampshire joined the frenzy surrounding Lafayette's visit on September 1, 1824, the rainy day on which he and his entourage arrived in Portsmouth, having spent the night in Newburyport. Although Lafayette proved to be a magnet for Americans of all races, colors, and genders, veterans of the Revolution, more than the others, hastened to greet him. September 1 happened to be the day of Franklin Pierce's graduation from Bowdoin College, and he had been selected to give an honorary oration in Latin. He wrote his father, General Benjamin Pierce, hoping he would attend the ceremony. In Peter Wallner's biography of Franklin Pierce, New Hampshire's only president, he writes, "In this he was disappointed, however, as the old general joined other revolutionary soldiers at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to honor General Lafayette, who was on his famous tour of the United States." So he dissed his son's college graduation and honorary Latin oration to see his old General Lafayette. After visiting Portsmouth and returning to Boston, Lafayette headed west to Lexington, Concord, and Worcester before he returned to New York City for his second visit there. In Lexington, a cloth banner painted with green paint on cloth, 39 feet long, was hung on an evergreen at the entrance to the town to welcome him. The next slide is that banner. You can't tell how big it really is, but it's still owned, and it was just restored by the Lexington Historical Society. On Sunday, October 3rd, after attending Lafayette left New York City in September 1824 and headed west to Philadelphia. On September 28th, he reached Philadelphia. Levasseur describes his reception on the first day of his visit. In a plain a short distance from the city, were about 6,000 men of the voluntary militia in handsome uniforms and underarms, forming a square in the middle of which General Lafayette was received to the sound of cannon by the civil and military authorities. After he had traversed the ranks of the militia on foot, and they had filed in front of him under the orders of General Cadwalader, we started marching with them in order to enter the city. Never was it more truthful to say that the entire population had come to meet General Lafayette. Only those inhabitants whose age or frailty prevented from going stayed in their houses. Stepped rows of seats had been built on each side of the streets to the height of the roof in order to hold the spectators. In the principal street of the suburb that we entered, all the different corps of trades were drawn up in battle array, as it were. At the head of each corps was a workroom, composed of some workers executing works of their profession. On the side of each of these workrooms was a banner on which we saw the portraits of Washington and Lafayette with this inscription: "To their wisdom and their courage we owe the free practicing of our trade." Among those corps of artisans, one noticed especially that of the printers. Above a press set up in the middle of the street was this inscription: "Freedom of the press, the surest guarantee of the rights of man." From this press poured forth abundantly odes to Lafayette and patriotic songs, which they threw into our carriage as we passed, or they distributed to the people who followed. After the artisans were the public schools, teachers and students all decorated with a Welcome Lafayette ribbon. A detachment of cavalry was at the head of the procession. The nation's guest was in a magnificent carriage pulled by 6 horses. Beside him they had seated the venerable Judge Peters, Richard Peters, who was the secretary and the moving spirit of the War Department during the Revolution. Following came the governor, the mayor, the municipal council, the judges in different carriages. Finally, George Lafayette and his father's secretary in a carriage similar to the general's carriage, and behind us 4 huge chariots resembling tents in their form rolled sluggishly, each containing 40 old revolutionary soldiers. Their enfeebled and trembled voices came to life again while blending with the sound of the martial instruments that accompanied them, and found a new vigor in order to repeat their former chants of war, to bless the names of Washington and Lafayette, and to cry out, "Long live liberty." A long infantry column brought up the rear. The procession, after having traversed all the principal streets and passed under 13 triumphal arches, stopped in front of the city hall where we alighted. While we took some moments of rest there, the deputies and the senators of Pennsylvania, the municipal council, the judiciary, and the military authorities assembled in the great hall, Independence Hall. Some moments later, at a signal given by 13 cannons, they brought us into this hall, and the general, having been conducted to the foot of the statue of Washington, the mayor gave a speech in which he said, 48 years ago in this city, in this very hall, that one could justly call the cradle of independence, an assembly of such men in the world that as the world has seen little of, eminent in virtue, in talent, and in patriotism, declared in the face of the world their determination to govern themselves by themselves, and to take for themselves and for their descendants a place among the nations. Very few of those who lived then are alive today, but in this number history will find, and we take pride in placing General Lafayette, whose entire life has been dedicated to the maintenance of liberty and to the defense of the inalienable rights of man. In his reply, Lafayette said in part, "It is here in this sacred enclosure that the independence of the United States was emphatically declared by a council of wise men. In anticipating that of all of America, it began for the civilized world a new era, that of a social order founded on the rights of man, an order of which the success and peace of your republic demonstrates the advantages every day. Here, sir, was formed our brave and virtuous Revolutionary Army. Here, inspired by Providence, came the happy idea to entrust command of it to our well-loved Washington, that warrior without blemish. But these memories and a throng of others are mixed with the profound regret for the loss of men, great and good, for whom we have to mourn. It is to their services, sir, to your respect for their memory, to the friendship that binds me to them, that I must assign a large part of the honors that I have received here and elsewhere, honors well above my personal merit." Afterwards, all the people were permitted to file before the nation's guest in order to shake his hand. The ceremony lasted several hours and offered the picture of the most perfect equality that it would be possible to imagine. Before generals marched working men with blackened hands, sinewy arms, sleeves rolled up. Beside a magistrate and a farmer clad in simple cloth. The priest and the artist came holding each other by the hand, and some children, assured of seeing their rights and their frailty respected, marched boldly in front of the soldiers and sailors. This variety of dress contrasted remarkably with the uniformity of countenances, all of which expressed the same sentiment of gratitude and admiration. Now, the next slide shows 2 images. They're engravings. They're probably from an original, the same engraving. But it's basically Independence Hall and the arch made of wood, and you see that there's statues on the top of the arch. Well, 2 of the statues on that arch were constructed or made by William Rush, a famous sculptor of the time, and they are still extant. They are category sculptures called Justice and Wisdom, and they are currently in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. The next slide are the two wooden sculptures, which still exist today from 1824, and they appear to be in very good condition. On Sunday, October 3rd, after attending morning services at Christ Church and afternoon vespers at St. Augustine's Roman Catholic Church, Lafayette dined with his friend Judge Peters, with whom he had carried on a correspondence since about 1820 at his home in Belmont. Monday the 4th was Lafayette's last full day in Philadelphia, and it was an eventful one. Accompanied by Judge Peters and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who was like a Lafayette groupie, he followed him around whenever he could, Lafayette visited the waterworks and several other public institutions, including the Pennsylvania Hospital, the Pennsylvania Institution for the Deaf and Dumb, and the state prison. Levasseur describes the visit to the state prison. It was a new prison. It's now, I believe, Eastern States Penitentiary, and it's like a museum now. But it was in construction. And the theory of it was that the Quakers had always believed in Reformation, and their doctrines weren't working, so they decided to try something else. And what they built was this huge structure with small cells around the perimeter and a big courtyard. And this was supposed to lead to reformation of the prisoner. So Levasseur writes, "This magnificent building was in construction when General Lafayette, accompanied by a committee charged with paying the respects of the city to him, went to visit it, and was welcomed by the worthy directors and administrators who explained to him the improvements obtained. Courage was necessary to dare to contradict men so virtuous, so experienced, so generous in intention as in the execution of their beneficent works. Lafayette pointed out to them that solitary imprisonment was a punishment that it was necessary to have experienced to judge well, that the virtuous and enlightened Malesherbes, who during his ministry under the old regime had mitigated the lot of state prisoners, regarded solitary imprisonment as conducive to madness. The general observed that during the 5 years of his captivity, he had passed one entire year in this manner, and another part of this time in seeing a companion for only 1 hour a day. And he added, while laughing, that he had even proven that it was not a means of reformation, since they had put him there for having wanted to revolutionize the people against despotism and aristocracy, that he spent his solitude in dreaming of it, and he left no more improved in that regard." Well, his statements led to a controversy in the press, with John Quincy Adams coming out in his defense against the new theory of solitary confinement, and others arguing for it. On that day, the 4th of October, there was a reception for the school children of Philadelphia and their teachers at the State House Square. The United States Gazette of October 6 states that there were upwards of 70 schools with an average of 70 or 80 pupils waiting the approach of General Lafayette. He also attended Washington Hall along with Adams and Judge Peters, where he was installed as an honorary member of the Washington Benevolent Society, Pennsylvania. In the evening, there was a grand civic ball given in honor of Lafayette at the new theater. The United States Gazette reported, which at this ball exceeded in magnificence and beauty anything we have ever beheld. There were between 1,500 and 1,700 people present. Lafayette left Philadelphia the following day on October 5. After Philadelphia, he headed south, arriving at Yorktown on October 19th for the ceremonies of Surrender Day. He reached Monticello on November 4th, spent 10 days with Jefferson, and then repaired to Montpelier and spent 4 days with James Madison. Lafayette spent much of the winter of 1824 and 1825 in Washington City, making a number of side trips to Virginia, Maryland, and western Pennsylvania. Although his original intent was only to visit the 13 first states, by this time he had received invitations from all the other states, and he decided to accept them. Thus, he left Washington City on February 23, 1825, for his southern and western campaigns. After stopping in Norfolk and Suffolk, Virginia, he traveled through North Carolina and into South Carolina. During the visit to South Carolina, Lafayette's party traveled to Columbia, the capital, where an incident occurred that encapsulates this man who made no distinctions of race, color, or creed. In many of the southern states, the local officials had decreed that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, would be prohibited from attending the public events. And the reason they did that was that Lafayette, by this time, was a well-known abolitionist, and they were concerned that he might say something or that they would be affected by his mere presence. In an autobiographical sketch by Dr. Maurice Moore, who was a militiaman on that day, he tells the story of what happened at the private reception after the public militia review and parade. He says that 2 sentinels with fixed bayonets on their guns were posted at the door to prevent the entrance to this private residence of intruders. Here I saw a strange but pleasant incident transpire. An old African, neatly dressed, came to the front door and started in, but the sentinels interposed their bayoneted guns to bar his entrance. The old man contemptuously pushed them aside, saying, "Shaw, Shaw, see guns afore you was born. Been where they been shot by soldiers too," and without farther opposition from anyone gained his way. He came straight to the room where the distinguished guest was standing among the crowd and said, "I come to see General Lafayette." Lafayette turned, looked at him, and remarked, "An old acquaintance. Don't tell me who it is." The Negro advanced to the Marquis and, bowing, held out his hand and said, "Howdy, Massa Lafayette. How do you do, sir? You remember me?" "Yes, stop. Don't tell me your name." "Ah, I have it. Pompey, belonging to Colonel Buchanan, the first servant who waited on me when I came to America. When I landed at Georgetown, I was taken first to the camp of General Buchanan near there, and Pompey waited on me," said he, as he shook warmly the old man's hand. The nobleman called for a glass of champagne with Pompey, which that worthy took with great dignity. Then he put out his hand and said, "Goodbye, Massa Lafayette. We getting old. We'll never meet again. God bless you." They shook hands again. Pompey went out, mounted his pony, and started for his home near Winnsboro, saying he'd come to see General Lafayette. Now he'd done that, he was going home. After his southern and western trips and his return to Boston for the Bunker Hill ceremony, Lafayette made a second trip to New Hampshire, this time to the capital city of Concord. Now, the master of ceremonies for that event at the State House was Benjamin Pierce, so he really didn't have to diss his son's college graduation, but he didn't know that Lafayette would be back in 1825. In order to accomplish his goal of visiting all 24 states, Lafayette headed east to Maine on June 23rd. He passed into Maine on the 24th, visiting Kennebunk, Saco, and Portland. He left Portland, Maine on Sunday the 26th, causing somewhat of a scandal. The governor was very upset that he was traveling on a Sunday, but he did this throughout the farewell tour because he was on a very tight schedule. In any event, he reached Concord, New Hampshire again on the 27th and headed west for Vermont. The town of Claremont was brilliantly illuminated when Lafayette's entourage arrived at 9:30 p.m. After staying the night there, he left at 9:30 a.m. on the 28th of June in a basket wagon belonging to Dr. Leonard Jarvis, traveling north along the Connecticut River to Cornish, where the carriage crossed the river to Windsor and relinquished its precious cargo to Vermont, the 24th state that Lafayette visited. The next slide, if I haven't skipped one, is that basket wagon. I saw it at the 2007 exhibition at the New York Historical Society. It is owned by the Museum of Art, History, and Carriages of Stony Brook. It's associated with Stony Brook College on Long Island. So that's the actual ceremonial wagon that he crossed into Vermont in. After crossing the state of Vermont, Lafayette traveled to New York City for the final time. Before he left New York on July 14th, a militia unit that had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette and his service in the Parisian National Guard saw him off. Now, the next slide is a poster that was, it's actually based on a painting that was commissioned by the National Guard in 1989, the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. The legend of the poster tells us about this militia unit and renaming itself National Guard. And then it says, by the end of the 19th century, all the militias in every state of the Union had adopted the name National Guard. So that's why it's called the National Guards today. Having passed through New Jersey, you just go through New Jersey. You don't. He actually spent a couple of days there and did a few interesting things. But he passed through New Jersey. He arrived at the Chestnut Street Wharf on the steamship Delaware in the early evening of July 16, 1825. That night he dined with city officials at the Franklin Hotel where he was lodged. His toast to Philadelphia that night was, "The great and beautiful city which welcomed me as a recruit and now welcomes me as a veteran." On July 20th, he attended a dinner in a large and elegant ballroom of Washington Hall to honor Richard Rush, recently returned from his service as minister to England and now Secretary of the Treasury, with Judge Peters in attendance. The newspaper account reports the utmost hilarity and decorum prevailed, and the evening was most agreeably spent. Lafayette's second and more extensive visit to the Fairmont Waterworks took place on July 21, 1825. At the conclusion of his tour, Lafayette said, and I quote, "The waterworks of Philadelphia is the perfect image of the American government, in which one finds simplicity, strength, and economy." Boy, those were the days, weren't they? Lafayette also visited the state of Schuylkill. Does anyone know what the state of Schuylkill is? I didn't think so.
There's a river.
Well, the river. But anyhow, I will tell you what or Levasseur will tell us what the state of Schuylkill is. In 1731, some citizens of Philadelphia joined to form an association, the dual object of which was pleasure and beneficence. Sounds good. They purchased an immense terrain near the falls of the Schuylkill. There they constructed a house suitable for their gatherings, elected a governor, a council, a secretary of state, a treasurer, and a judge, adopted a particular seal, and constituted themselves Schuylkill Colony. More than a half-century passed without the existence of the colony being disturbed by the slightest of mishaps. Each day was marked by blessings and joy and confidence. And confidence were evident at all the periodic banquets at which the citizens were assembled at the same table, but subject to the fate common to all states, all of which have their vicissitudes. Schuylkill Colony was to have its revolution too. In 1783, following a dinner of more than 50 place settings, the nation revolted and declared itself independent. It intended to revise its constitution, and Schuylkill Colony became in several hours the Republican state of Schuylkill, without the mother countries making the least attempt to oppose it. From that time, the new republic did not stop increasing its strength or its wealth. Its pleasures and beneficence have followed the same progression. Master today of more extensive territory than it acquired in a treaty with a farmer. It has transferred the seat of its government, that is to say, its fishing nets, its kitchen, and its cellar 3 miles further downriver, under the cool shade trees that the waters of the Schuylkill always irrigate. It is there that General Lafayette was received by the citizens and magistrates who, dressed as fishermen, had come to wait for him at the border of the state. In a short but eloquent speech, the Secretary of State recalled the history of the Republic since its founding to the present, and ended by notifying him that the title and rights of citizenship had been bestowed on him by a unanimous vote. As soon as the general had expressed his acceptance and his gratitude, they dressed him in the national costume, and his head protected with a wide straw hat. He took part in the occupations of the community, just as George Lafayette and Mr. de Sion, who was another who came along with them. So I, too, was admitted to share in the work of the day. The people and the magistrates, everyone without distinction, began to work. Having boarded the boats of the Republic, we caught an abundance of fish, and at 4 o'clock we took our places at a banquet prepared by our own hands. Never was a meal more joyous, nor watered by a better wine, and for a long time we will recall the pleasures and the happiness that they enjoy in the state of Schuylkill. In his letter to his friend Richard Peters, dated April 12, 1826, writing from France, Lafayette wrote, "Remember me to my old friends and new friends, ladies and gentlemen, not forgetting the state of Schuylkill." Lafayette departed Philadelphia by steamship on July 25th. Like Churchill in World War II, Lafayette lived in the White House in August and September of 1825 during the presidency of John Quincy Adams. On September 7th, 1825, Adams sent Lafayette off aboard a new frigate that he named the Brandywine in honor of Lafayette. In his journal, Levasseur chronicles Lafayette's visits with his old friends John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, and his new friend Andrew Jackson. And through Levasseur's eyes, we get glimpses of the characters of these early American leaders. Jefferson is the ever-gracious host. Levasseur comments on the good appearance and the cheerfulness of the Negroes of Monticello as attesting to his humanity, to the humanity of their master, but elsewhere describes slavery as a crime against humanity and advocates for the education of blacks and gradual emancipation, reflecting Lafayette's well-known views. At Jackson's home in Tennessee, Lafayette is shown pistols that Lafayette had given to Washington in 1778 and now belong to Jackson. When Lafayette recognizes them and comments that he felt true satisfaction in finding them in the hands of a man so worthy of such a legacy, Jackson blushes and, quote, his eye gleams as if on a day of victory. And my favorite story in the book, the Schuylkill story is a close second, takes place on August 6th, 1825. Lafayette comes down for breakfast at the White House, and he says, I'd like to pay my last respects to your predecessor, Mr. Monroe. And John Quincy Adams says, I'll go with you. And he arranges for a party of 2 or 3 carriages, or about 12 or 13 people. And they leave, and there's no security. This is 1825. So they're driving along, and they get to the Potomac, and it's a toll bridge. The president pays the toll, and they continue on their way, and they hear a clatter behind them, and the toll taker's running after them. And so they stop, and the toll taker says, Mr. President, you're 11 cents short. So John Quincy Adams, President Adams, comes out of the carriage, and the scene is like, they're counting carriages and people and money, and he realizes that he was 11 cents short. But while this is going on, the toll taker recognizes the nation's guest, General Lafayette. He says, oh, I'm not going to take a toll for the nation's guest. And President Adams, being the upright person he is, said, no, I insist. We are not on a public function. We are only going to visit a friend. And the author, Levasseur, says it is remarkable that in every other country, that this is the only toll that was paid for Lafayette on the entire farewell tour. And it came in the presence of the head of state, where in every other country, he never would have had to pay a toll when being in the presence of the head of state. Now, while in America, Lafayette was the first foreigner to address a joint session of Congress, and he was addressed by Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who called him a faithful and fearless champion of liberty. The Congress voted Lafayette a national reward of $200,000 and 24,000 acres of land in northern Florida. $200,000 was not chump change. It was about $3.5 million in today's money at the time. Lafayette was one of the earliest travelers on the Erie Canal as he returned from the west in time to arrive in Boston in June of 1825. It is probable that Lafayette was greeted by over 3 million people, about 1/4 of the population during the farewell tour. Lafayette died on May 20, 1834, but not before he had played a major role in still another revolution, the July Revolution of 1830 that overthrew the Bourbon monarchy and replaced it with Louis Philippe, King of the French. He was buried in Picpus Cemetery in Paris with soil from Bunker Hill sprinkled over his coffin. President Jackson gave Lafayette the same military honors as Adams had given to Washington on his death. America mourned. There were eulogies in churches, in state legislatures, and in private societies. On September 6, 1834, which would have been Lafayette's 77th birthday, Edward Everett eulogized him at Faneuil Hall in Boston. Now, Edward Everett is the same speaker who preceded Lincoln at Gettysburg. Now, his addresses were normally 2 to 3 hours, and the Gettysburg address was. And of course, Lincoln's was like 2 minutes. And they exchanged letters thereafter congratulating each other. But the next slide is, that's a funerary badge worn on that occasion by the mayor of Quincy, the mayor of Boston, Josiah Quincy. Now, that speech is available online, the Everett speech, and it's a really nice biography of Lafayette. It's about, I don't know, 120 pages, so it certainly took 2 to 3 hours. On December 31, John Quincy Adams, then a congressman, gave the official eulogy of the United States. And that speech is only 85 pages long, and I'm not going to read it all, but I will read a little excerpt from it. Pronounce him one of the first men of his age, and you have not yet done him justice. Turn back your eyes upon the records of time, summon from the creation of the world to this day the mighty dead of every age and every clime, and where among the race of merely mortal men shall one be found who, as the benefactor of his kind, shall claim to take precedence of Lafayette. In early January of 1835, 50,000 copies were ordered to be published by the House, and another 10,000 for the use of the Senate, which means there was one copy of that eulogy for every 220 Americans published at that time. When he visited the White House and Congress in November of 2007, France's President Sarkozy repeatedly referred to Lafayette's legacy. At the White House, he told the story of the toast at the birthday dinner that President Adams held for Lafayette on September 6, 1825, shortly before his departure. This toast is reported in Levasseur's book. Towards the end of the meal, the president, departing from diplomatic customs that prohibited toasts at his table, got up and made the following toast. To February 22 and to September 6, birthdays of Washington and Lafayette. Profoundly moved to see his name thus associated with that of Washington, the general expressed his gratitude to the president and gave this toast. To July 4, birthday of liberty in the two hemispheres. When he addressed a joint session of Congress later that day, Sarkozy noted that he was speaking under the common gaze of Washington and Lafayette. What he was referring to is the next slide, a monumental portrait in the House chamber given as a gift by Ari Scheffer, the painter of Lafayette. It is one of two portraits in the House chamber. There, on the other side of the rostrum, there is a monumental portrait of Washington, which actually came later to complement the Lafayette. Having met Sarkozy in Washington, Senator John McCain said, and I'm not making this up, if you don't believe me, you can go on the Cornell University website and look at their exhibit, Liberty and Lafayette. John McCain said, Sarkozy is the first real pro-American Frenchman I've met since Lafayette. I will end this talk with an obituary, not of Lafayette, but of an obscure Philadelphian by the name of David Kramer. David Kramer died during the blizzard of 1888. He didn't die of the blizzard, but he died while it was ongoing. And the obituary starts in all caps, or the headline of the obituary is, "A man who knew Lafayette dead." David Kramer died on Monday evening, the 12th, after several months' illness of a complication of diseases in the 73rd year of his age. So keep that in mind. He was 73 in 88. He many years ago resided in Philadelphia, where he was a contractor and erected many fancy buildings for the leading men of that city. He was a member of the F&AM, that's the Masons, Carpenters Association, which was a guild, and IO of OF, the Oddfellows, and at one time was an active member of the city council. In his youth, he had the pleasure of seeing and conversing with General Lafayette during his last visit to America. Well, if you do the math, David Kramer, the successful builder and city councilor, was 9 years old when he met General Lafayette along with 5,000 other school children outside Independence Hall on October 4, 1824, and that was apparently the most important event of his accomplished life. I wonder how many other young Americans who greeted Lafayette in 1824, 1825, when America went crazy over Lafayette, told their children or their children's children, like the grandmother in Louise May Alcott's book, about their experience, and how many 19th century obituaries recall meeting the faithful and fearless champion of liberty, as Henry Clay described him, or in the words of Philadelphia's Mayor Robert Wharton on September 28, 1824, the man whose entire life has been dedicated to the maintenance of liberty and to the defense of the inalienable rights of man. Thank you. Well, we will take questions. If you don't have questions, I'll just keep talking. But I raised a question for someone to ask about how it came to pass that this 19-year-old captain in the French army was given a commission by our representative in Paris, Silas Deane, as a major general. Major general being the second highest rank, second to Washington. There were 6 or 7 or 8 major generals. The answer simply is he was a good negotiator. He said that I want a commission as a general, and I will buy and provision a ship and take others with me. And he took about 14 or 15 other officers on the Victoire was the name of the ship. It was just a commercial ship that he outfitted. I think it had 1 gun. His instructions to the captain was, if we get intercepted by the British, sink it, is what he said. But in any event, one of his passengers was the Baron de Kalb, who became an American hero. He was a much more experienced soldier. He had been to America on kind of a scouting mission for a year or two. He was fluent in the language, and he taught Lafayette English on the ship. He really had no knowledge of English before he got on the ship. Any questions? Yes?
How was it the French military allowed one of their bright young officers to just pick up the name?
Well, they didn't. They didn't allow him. Basically, that's a whole other story. He became inspired by the American Revolution, and he had 2 very close friends who also became inspired. One was the Viscount de Noailles, who was his brother-in-law and his wife's cousin, and the Count de Ségur, and they were very close, and they were in the military together, and they trained together, and they all were going to go. So they all went back to their parents to get permission. And the Count de Noailles, the Viscount's father said no. Ségur's father said no. Lafayette went to his father-in-law. That was his closest thing to a father, and he said no. And the other 2 kind of acceded to that admonition or that decision, and Lafayette didn't. He secretly plotted to leave, notwithstanding that. He wrote, and there were some really interesting things. Early in 1777, he was sent to England because his wife's uncle was the minister to England on a trip. And there he is. He meets George III, some of the generals. They want to take him to their military installations. He refuses because he didn't think that was right, because he knew he was going to America. So when he got back, and this planning was all ongoing. So when he got back, he was about ready to leave, and he sent a letter to his father-in-law. And his father-in-law was absolutely up in arms, went to the king and got a what is it called? Like an arrest warrant. What is it called? A letter de cachet? Letter de cachet or something? Yeah. So there's, they're in southern France. The ship goes over to Spain just in case. He goes back to Marseille, he meets with some people. He decides to go anyway. He gets in a disguise, and he passes the same farmhouse he was when he was dressed as himself. He's dressed as a woman, and he's afraid that the girl's going to recognize him. He goes, shh, don't say anything. And basically, the French were supporting us militarily, even at that time in 1777, but it was all secret, supposedly, although the English knew what was going on. They were not ready to come out overtly and declare war at that time. So they were probably pretty upset when he actually did leave and and came to America. So he didn't really have their permission, although he told himself that they really wanted him to go, other than his father-in-law. Next. Yes, ma'am.
That our Congress gave $200,000, which amounted to like $2.5 million, plus a land grant.
Yes.
Where was that? Does it still exist?
It was in the Tallahassee area, and that's why there's a Lake Lafayette down there.
What happened to it?
It got sold when he died. I think his descendants just sold it. Yeah, I don't know. No, they don't own anything. Yeah. But that was a lot of money. You couldn't get anything out of Congress. At that time, it was like today. But it was a lot of money. Now there's a nice story also in the book. So he gets this award of $200,000. Okay. And there were like 16 people in both houses who voted against it. And they were getting pilloried in the press for voting against. How could you vote against Lafayette? So several of them came to see him where he was staying in Washington City. And they started explaining, it's not that we don't love you, General, it's just that we just believe that this isn't really an appropriate use of government money. And they were halfway through their explanation, and he said, please stop. There's no need to say anything. If I had been your comrade in the House or the Senate, there would have been 17 of us. And that made all the newspapers, and it got these men off the hook politically. He actually visited the wife of one of them when he went out west. So there was no hard feelings. So the other states started wanting to give him money, and he finally had to put a stop to it. Virginia, Maryland, wherever he went, they wanted to, it's like a collection plate. But he was broke, so that was very helpful. He'd been broke since exile. Any other questions? All right.
If there are no more questions, we're going to thank you very much.
Thank you.